She arrived at his door in the blue hour before dawn, frost on her coat, nothing in her hands but a folded piece of paper, and the particular stillness of someone who has already decided they will not beg. You need to understand what that moment cost her, and you need to understand what it unlocked in him. Because what happened over the following winter on that high country homestead was not a rescue, and it was not charity, and it was not the neat repair of two broken things. It was something rarer and quieter and more lasting than any of that. Stay with this story. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was standing at his door in the dark, and he had a rifle in his hands, and neither of them had spoken a name yet. And that moment, that particular breath between strangers on the edge of winter, that is where we have to begin. Rewind to the month before. Dry wind to the October afternoon when Eli Voss walked the fence line of his upper pasture and counted, as he did every fall, the exact number of posts that had heaved out of the frozen ground over the summer. He counted 11. He always counted. The numbering was a habit that had come to him from his father, who had told him once that a man who could not account for his losses. Eli took his land seriously. He took it as a discipline and a comfort, and in the 3 years since his wife Clara had died of a fever in early spring, as the primary reason to get up before light every morning and start the stove. He had come to the land 9 years ago at 20 missing with Clara beside him. The land was 240 acres of high country meadow and timber in the Sulphur Creek Valley east of the Divide, where winter arrived without ceremony and stayed without apology. Eli had homesteaded the place 9 years ago with Clara, had built the main cabin with timber he cut himself and a barn he raised with the help of 3 neighbors who no longer live close enough to call on. He was 36 years old in that autumn. He had brown hands and a quiet face and a way of looking at a piece of broken equipment as if he were reading a long and serious letter. He did not visit town more than once a month if he could avoid it. He was not, he would have told you, a lonely man. He would have been imprecise about that. He had 2 horses, a milk cow named after nothing, a dog of indeterminate breed he called Patches because the name seemed to embarrass neither of them, and 41 head of cattle that needed to come down from the summer range before the first hard snow. The work of the autumn was clear and sequential and left him almost no time to notice anything that was not the work. He counted the fence posts, made a note in the small leather-bound ledger he kept in his coat pocket, and walked back toward the cabin in the late light with the specific satisfaction of a man who knows what the next 3 weeks hold for him. He was not expecting anyone. He had not been expecting anyone in any meaningful sense for 3 years. The letter reached him on a Wednesday in late October, carried out from town by the postmaster's boy, who rode the 6 miles with it folded twice inside his jacket because he had learned that mail left loose in a saddlebag arrived crumpled. Eli gave the boy a cup of coffee and a biscuit and read the letter once, standing at the kitchen table, before he sat down and read it again. It was from Thomas Voss, his father's brother, his only living relative of any proximity. Thomas had ranched in the lower country 2 counties south, and had been, for the entirety of Eli's life, the most reliably competent man he knew. The letter was dated the 3rd of October and had taken 19 days to reach him, which was itself a message about the condition of the roads. Thomas had died on the 5th of October. A stroke, the letter said, in Thomas's own handwriting, though by the time it reached Eli, the man who'd written it had been in the ground for more than 2 weeks. There was, Eli thought, something deeply characteristic about Thomas, in that writing ahead of his own death, accounting for it, arranging what needed arranging before the fact. What Thomas had arranged was this. A young woman named Senna Drum, 23 years old, who had come to him 3 years prior from a family that had dissolved in the way that families in hard country sometimes dissolved piece by piece until there was no more family left. Thomas had taken her in as a housekeeper and had taught her, apparently, a great deal more than housekeeping. She could read a land survey, repair a saddle, calculate a feed ratio, and set a broken bone if circumstances required it. The letter said all of this with the flat economy of a man who expected to be believed. Thomas did not have other arrangements for her. He had no other kin willing to take responsibility. The neighbors who had worked his lower country land with him were dispersed or aged or both. There was some small matter of the ranch itself being encumbered by a promissory note to a man named Aldous Crane, a land speculator and occasional moneylender out of the county seat, who Thomas suspected would move quickly on the property. Thomas had written a second letter which was enclosed, addressed to Sena herself, and he asked Eli to honor what it contained. Eli read Thomas's letter to him 4 times that evening. He sat with it and with a cup of coffee that went cold, and then with a second cup, and he thought about Clara, who had been gone for 3 years and 2 months. He thought about Thomas, who had last visited 5 years ago, and who had sat at this same table and told him, without being asked, that he thought Eli and Clara had built something real, and that it was good to see. He thought about a 23-year-old woman somewhere, 2 counties south, who had received a letter from a dying man, and was now, in all practical terms, alone. He went to bed without deciding anything. He woke in the dark, built up the fire, and drove the last of the cattle down from the upper range. He reset 9 of the 11 fence posts, leaving 2 for the following spring, when the ground would be workable again. He winterized the barn with a practiced efficiency that his hands knew without consulting his mind, and on the morning of the 8th day after the letter arrived, he drove his wagon to town. He intended to speak to the lawyer Hartley Munn, who had drafted his own homestead papers and who was in Eli's estimation a precise and honest man, and to understand exactly what a ward of Thomas's amounted to. What he learned from Munn over the course of 40 minutes was this: Thomas's promissory note to Aldous Crane was for $380, secured against the lower country ranch and callable on death, under the terms Thomas had apparently signed without reading closely enough. Crane had already filed to collect the lower country property would be sold to satisfy the debt, and what remained after the note was paid would be nothing, because the note was almost exactly the value of the land. Sena Drum would have no claim on any of it. She was not kin, she was a ward on a verbal agreement, which was not, Munn told him gently, the same as any kind of claim. Eli asked whether Thomas had left any instruction in writing regarding Senna. Munn said that Thomas had come to him 6 weeks before and discussed the matter, but had not executed any formal document. There had been a plan that was overtaken by events. This, too, Eli thought, was characteristic of Thomas. To see clearly, to move toward the right thing, and to be a little late. He drove home. He thought for 2 more days. And on the 11th day after the letter, he wrote a reply to the address Thomas had given, which was the post office of the nearest town to the lower country ranch. And he said that Sena Drum was welcome at his place if she chose to come, that the work was real and the wages would be honestly paid, which was not a small endorsement. He folded the letter, gave it to the postmaster's boy on the boy's next pass, and went back to work. He did not know whether she would come. He gave it a reasonable chance. He thought about it no more than 6 or 7 times a day for the next 3 weeks, which was, for Eli, the approximate equivalent of not thinking about it at all. She came in the middle of November on a Tuesday, in the dark, hour that is not quite night and not quite morning, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak under boots. He heard Patches come off the porch and give one sharp bark, the kind reserved for humans rather than animals, and he was out of bed with the rifle before he was fully awake. He opened the door in his coat thrown over his undershirt and found her standing 6 feet back from the porch step, which he later understood was a careful distance, chosen so that she would not appear to be rushing him. She was of middle height and slight build under a heavy coat that he recognized as one of Thomas's by the particular wool of it. She had a canvas bag at her feet and the folded paper in her gloved hands, and she was unmistakably cold. Not dangerously cold, he assessed in about 4 seconds, but the kind of cold that has been endured for some hours without complaint. Her face was composed. Her eyes were direct. She did not look at the rifle, he said. Sena Drum. She said, Eli Voss. He stepped aside, and she came in. And the first thing she did, before she said anything further, was go to the stove and open the firebox and look at the coal situation inside it with the expression of a person checking something they intended to maintain. He was not sure what to do with that. He put the rifle back. She handed him the folded paper. It was Thomas's letter to her, the enclosed one he had mentioned, and she watched him read it with the patience of someone who has already read the thing many times and no longer needed to. Thomas had written to her with the clarity of a man with nothing left to protect. He told her that he had meant to formalize things long before this, and that he was sorry he had not. He told her that Eli was the only person he trusted completely in a world that had not given him many candidates for that distinction. He told her that the place in the Sulphur Creek Valley was a real piece of ground, and that a real piece of ground was worth arriving at. He told her she was the most capable person he had raised, and he phrased it that way. Raised, not employed or taken in, but raised, as if she were the thing he was most careful of in all his arrangements. He told her there were 2 reasons to go, and that the first one was that she would have honest work and honest wages, and that the second one he left for time to clarify, because some reasons could not be explained, only discovered. Eli read it twice. He folded it and set it on the table. She said, he thought you would need to know all of it. He said, he was right. He boiled water, and they drank tea, and did not speak much, and she looked at the cabin with the thorough eyes of a person inventorying a situation, and he looked at her as carefully as he could without being rude. She was not grateful in the collapsing way of someone who has been rescued. She was deliberate and quiet, and when she finished the tea, she asked where she would sleep, and he showed her the small room off the kitchen that had been Clara's sewing room, and was now a room with a cot and 2 hooks on the wall, and a window that let in the east light. And she said that would do, and that was the end of the first night. That was the 3rd of November. He marked it in his ledger, not because he planned to, but because he wrote in the ledger every morning, and it seemed like the kind of fact that ought to be recorded. For the first 2 weeks, she proved herself with an efficiency that he found, privately, startling. She was not showing off. He came to understand this by about the 5th day, when he noticed that she never did her work where he could easily see it, never positioned herself for observation. She simply did what needed doing, and the evidence accumulated. The barn organized in a way that saved him 4 steps per feeding. The larder inventoried and restocked with a margin he had not planned for. The milk cow milked on a schedule that improved the yield by a measure he estimated at roughly a quarter. She repaired a harness with a stitching technique he did not know, and that held, he calculated, better than his own. She asked him for nothing. On the 9th day, she corrected his technique for banking the overnight fire. She did it once, briefly, without emphasis, showing him how to position the larger pieces so that the heat would hold through the coldest hours without requiring replenishment at 3 in the morning. He had been waking at 3 to rebuild the fire for 3 years. He did not tell her this. He simply adjusted his technique and did not wake at 3 anymore. And he thought about that small adjustment on several evenings thereafter, with a feeling he could not name precisely, and did not try to. He worked the outer land and the livestock. She maintained the interior and took on the calculations he found tedious, and she apparently did not. The feed ratios, the supply list, the careful accounting of what would run out and when. She was better at the arithmetic than he was, and made no effort to conceal it. He made no effort to mind. In the evenings, they sat near the stove. She had brought with her, in the canvas bag, a set of tools for a craft he did not immediately recognize: small blades, a collection of wooden forms, a quantity of thin leather, and fine sinew. He watched her work for several evenings before he asked, and she told him she made small pressed figures, animals and birds, and occasionally faces, pressing the dampened leather over the wooden forms until it held its shape, and then tooling the detail in with the smaller blade. She had learned it, she said, from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before that, and it was the kind of skill that required patience more than strength, and that rewarded attention to the particular character of each piece of material, because no 2 pieces of leather were exactly alike, and the work that suited one would ruin another. He watched her hands at this work for several evenings before he realized he was watching them, and made himself look away. The fire banked well that winter. By the end of the 3rd week, the silences between them had changed in texture. They were not the silences of people who have nothing to say and have decided to say it. They were the silences of people who have begun to trust that the other one will still be there when the silence ends. He noticed this the way he noticed the fence posts, by counting, by taking stock, by acknowledging to himself the particular weight a thing has when it is present, and the different weight it has when it is absent. He told her about Clara on a Thursday evening in late November, which surprised him. He had not planned to. He said that Clara had died in the spring 3 years ago, and that she had been the best company he had ever known, and that he had not entirely worked out what to do with the fact of that. Sina listened, without filling the silence with comfort, which was exactly what he needed. And after a moment she said that Thomas had told her about Clara, that he had said she had been a woman worth missing, and Eli said that was correct. And then they sat quietly for a while, and the fire held. She told him about her family in pieces, over several evenings. The father, who had worked a small farm 3 states east, and who had been a decent enough man until 2 years of drought, made him something different. The mother who had made the leather figures, and who had died when Sina was 16. The farm that had been sold for less than its worth. The brother who had gone somewhere west and not written. She told it without performance, in the plain way she did most things, as if the facts were simply facts, and the feelings were simply feelings, and neither required apology. He began to teach her the land. He showed her the creek crossing that was safe in spring flood, and the one that was not. He showed her where the timber gave way to a long open ridge that you could see from 20 miles in clear weather. And she stood at the top of it in the late November light and looked out for a long time without speaking. And he stood beside her and thought that Thomas had been right to call this a real piece of ground. She taught him her language in the evenings, a few words at a time, the language of her mother's people, who had known this high country before any deed was drafted for it. He was a slow student, and she was an exacting teacher, and they disagreed occasionally about his pronunciation, and these were the first arguments, and they were conducted with a dry precision that was. She told him the word for the ridge and the word for the creek in its winter low, and the word for the particular gray of the sky before heavy snow. He repeated them badly, and she corrected him without mercy, and he went to sleep on several evenings, mouthing the syllables until they settled. This was a thing that went together, the word and the land it named. It had not occurred to him before that the land might have 2 names, and that knowing both might make it more fully itself. On the 1st of December, Nora Fitch came out from town with a warning. Nora ran the dry goods store and served as the closest thing to a town historian that the valley had, which meant she knew everything and was judicious about how much of it she told. She pulled her wagon up to the cabin in the early afternoon and drank the tea Sina offered, and then looked at Eli across the table and said that Aldous Crane had been asking questions. Crane had satisfied the promissory note against Thomas's lower property, as expected, and the property was now his. But Nora said he was not satisfied with that. He was claiming that Thomas had owed him a second debt, an informal one secured against nothing written, and that the informal debt had been assumed by Thomas's heir. Crane's position, as Nora understood it, was that Eli, as Thomas's nearest living relative and the effective recipient of Thomas's estate, had assumed this second debt. Nora said Crane had no paperwork for it, and that she personally did not believe Thomas had ever borrowed the money, but that Crane had a way of creating documentation after the fact when it suited him, and that Eli should speak to Hartley Munn.
Eli said, "What does he actually want?"
Nora said, "He wants your upper acreage. The $200 is just the door he intends to come through." He thanked her. She finished her tea and looked at Sina with the expression of a woman making an assessment, and the assessment appeared, from what Eli could observe, to be a favorable one, because Nora told Sina that if she needed anything from town, she should send word with the postmaster's boy, and she would bring it out personally. Then she drove back toward town, and Eli sat at the table and thought about Aldous Crane for the remainder of the afternoon. Crane arrived on the 7th of December. He came with 2 men, which was his way of communicating something while maintaining the pretense of a courtesy call. Eli heard them from the barn and came out to meet them in the yard, and Sina came out of the cabin behind him without being asked, which he noted. She stood to his left and slightly back, and she was carrying nothing except an expression of complete composure. Crane was a tall man of 50 or so, carefully dressed for someone who had ridden 6 miles in December. He had the manner of a man who believed that the quantity of his certainty was an argument. He introduced himself as if Eli might not know who he was, and then explained, in a tone of professional sympathy, that there was a matter of Thomas's debt that had come to rest regrettably. He produced a folded paper which he described as the record of the informal loan. Eli looked at the paper without touching it, and noted that the handwriting, which was supposed to be Thomas's, was not Thomas's. He had 4 of Thomas's letters in the cabin. He knew Thomas's hand. He said, "I don't recognize that as Thomas's writing." Crane said, "Memory can play tricks on a man." Eli said, "I'll speak to Hartley Munn." Crane said that Munn was a fine lawyer, but that debt was debt, and that it would be simpler for everyone to resolve the matter privately, and that he was willing to accept, in lieu of the $200 he was owed, a deed to the northern parcel of Eli's upper acreage, which he described as probably more than fair given the market. Eli looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "That parcel runs to the ridge." Crane said, "It does." Eli said no. One of Crane's men shifted his weight in the way that men shift their weight when they are calculating options. Sina did not shift her weight at all, and Eli was aware of her stillness beside him, the way you are aware of something solid and reliable in a moment that requires solidity. Crane said, "I'd hate for this to become a legal matter." Eli said, "You should speak to Munn then, and tell him you'd hate that." Crane studied him for a moment longer, then smiled the smile of a man who is deferring rather than retreating, which was a distinction Eli understood clearly. He rode out with his men, and the forged paper and the smile, and Eli and Sina stood in the yard until the sound of the horses had faded into the cold air. She said, "He'll come back." He said, "Probably. We'll go to town tomorrow." She nodded and went inside, and he stood in the yard a minute longer, looking at the ridge that ran along the top of the upper acreage, the ridge with 2 names now, his and hers. And he thought about what Thomas had written, that there was a second reason, and that it could not be explained, only discovered. He had been considering Thomas's second reason for some weeks. He was a careful man, and he wanted to be sure he was not confusing what he wanted with what Thomas had intended, because those could be different things, and only one of them was honest. He stood in the cold, and he was as honest with himself as he knew how to be. The wanting was not confusion. It had arrived quietly and completely, the way a good thing sometimes does, without announcement, like the morning light coming to the ridge. He did not act on it that evening. He drove to town the next morning and spent 2 hours with Hartley Munn, and came home with a clearer understanding of his position, which was stronger than Crane wanted him to believe. The forged document was a risk Crane was taking, and risk was a thing that could be turned. Munn said there were 3 things that would help. The original of Thomas's letters showing his real handwriting, a sworn statement from anyone who had known Thomas's financial dealings, and time. There were procedures, Munn said, and they were slow, but they favored documented truth over fabricated claims, provided the documented truth was organized and presented correctly. Ellie brought the 4 letters home and sat at the table that evening with the ledger and the letters and organized what he had with the care of a man who has been keeping records all his life and now understands why. Sina sat across from him and helped him arrange the dates and the handwriting comparisons and the accounting of what Thomas had and had not owed, working with the same precision she brought to the feed ratios, which was to say, considerable precision. And the work between them was quiet and companionable and felt without ceremony, like a partnership. When the papers were in order, he put them aside and sat for a moment looking at the fire, and then he said, "Thomas's letter to you. The second reason." She looked up. He said, "I think I know what it was." He was careful about saying it correctly. He said, "I've been out here a long time, and I've been good at that. Being out here alone, I've told myself I was good at it. This winter." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He knew you would need persuading from a direction you respected." He said, meaning himself. She said, meaning you would not have written to a stranger out of pure loneliness. "But you would do right by Thomas," he said. "That's accurate." He paused. He said he was right that I needed persuading. He was also right about you. She looked at him steadily. She said, "What was he right about?" He said that you'd be worth the persuasion. The fire held. Outside the cabin, the snow was coming down in the straight and purposeful way that said it intended to stay, and the valley was silent under it, and the ridge with its 2 names was white and clear in the dark. He said, "I would like you to stay, not for the wages, for good if you're willing. I know that's more than you came here expecting, and I know it's the worst time of year for a decision that size. But I think it's the right thing, and I think you know it too, and I'd rather say it plainly than let it drift until the spring thaw." She was quiet for long enough that he began to revise his expectations. Then she said you'd want to keep the name. He understood she was asking about her own name, her full name, the one that held her mother and her mother's mother, and the language she was teaching him, and the land she had looked at from the ridge. She said, "And you understand, I'm not grateful in the way that asks for less." He said, "I know exactly what you are." She looked at the fire. She said, "All right, then that was all. It was enough." The plainness of it felt to him like the truest thing in a year that had already held a great deal of truth. They drove to town together 3 days later and sat in Munn's office for an hour and a half and did what needed doing in the legal fashion, which Munn conducted with the matter-of-fact dignity he brought to all his work. Nora Fitch appeared not by accident and served as witness, and she and Sina walked together back to the dry goods store after while Eli settled the paperwork, and when they came out together 20 minutes later, they were talking in the familiar way of women who have decided to trust each other, which Eli observed without comment, and which filled him with a specific and unremarkable gratitude. It was a thing that went together. He had not expected to understand that so clearly, this soon. But some things were like that. You could not explain them in advance. You could only recognize them when they arrived. Aldous Crane came back on the 14th of December with 4 men and a rider who introduced himself, with visible discomfort, as Deputy Farrell of the County Sheriff's Office. Farrell's discomfort was itself informative. The deputy held the paper Crane had produced and looked at Eli with the expression of a man who has been asked to carry something he has doubts about. Munn was with them. Ellie had written to him the evening before with the reasonable assumption that Crane would escalate, and Munn had risen before dawn and ridden out, and he now stood beside Eli in the yard with a document case under his arm, and the composed expression of a man who has organized his paperwork correctly. Munn addressed Deputy Farrell directly and politely, which was also the correct move, because Farrell was not a bad man, only a cautious one in the employ of a county structure that Crane had influence in. Munn presented the 4 original letters in Thomas's authenticated hand, presented a sworn statement he had obtained by post from a neighbor of Thomas's lower country place who had known the man's finances well and was prepared to testify that no such loan had ever been discussed, and then presented the marriage certificate showing that Eli and Sina were joint holders of the homestead record, and that any claim against the property now required both their consents, which would not be forthcoming, where the forged document would be examined by people who did such examinations for a living. Farrell read the documents with the thoroughness of a man who was privately grateful for the out they provided. He looked at Crane, and Crane looked at Eli, and Eli looked back at Crane with the same expression he used on broken equipment. Reading a long and serious letter, reaching the end, determining there was nothing in it worth saving, Crane said, "This isn't finished." Munn said, "It is for today, and I'd advise you to think carefully about the forgery question before you file anything further." Crane held Eli's gaze a moment longer, establishing what he apparently believed was a record of his intentions. Then he turned his horse and rode with his men and the deputy back down the valley road, and the sound of them faded into the morning cold. And that was the last morning Aldous Crane came to the Sulphur Creek Valley. He did not file. Munn told them, in January, that word had come from the county clerk that Crane had quietly withdrawn his claim. The calculation had changed. The forged document was a liability he could not afford to have examined too closely, and the homestead was now documented to 2 people with a lawyer and a county record in their corner, and the neighbor's sworn statement was a stone in the road he had not expected. He would find easier prey. Men like Crane always did. But he would not find it here. The winter settled after that. Settled the way good winters do, which is to say it was still cold and still hard, and still demanded the full attention of anyone trying to live well inside it. But the cold and the hardness were simply weather, and weather was not an adversary. Eli had always known how to live inside a condition. He was learning that winter to live inside a good one. She continued making the pressed leather figures in the evenings. By February there were a dozen of them arranged on the shelf above the kitchen table, a hawk and a deer, and a small rendered version of the ridge that Eli recognized immediately and that he thought was the best small portrait of a piece of land he had ever seen. She gave him one, a horse that was recognizably not a specific horse, but was somehow every horse he had ever worked alongside, and he set it on the windowsill where the morning light could find it, and it stayed there. he learned to say more of her language. He was still a poor student, but a persistent one, and by February he could hold a short conversation in her mother's tongue about practical things, weather and work and the names of things, and she told him once, in one of the driest tones she possessed, that his pronunciation had graduated from painful to merely, and he took this as high praise, and she allowed it. She learned the land with the systematic care she brought to everything. She learned the safe crossing and the unsafe one, and the 3 places where timber could be cut without compromising the watershed, and the particular lean of the cabin's northern wall that meant it needed caulking before April. She learned the 11 fence posts. She came with him the day in March, when he went back to count them, and she counted beside him, and the count was 9 that year, which was 2 fewer than the 11 of the year before, and he said that was a good winter for posts, and she said that it was a good winter generally, and he agreed with her, and that was also enough. Thomas had written that some reasons could not be explained, only discovered. Eli had discovered his. It was not complicated, when you were honest about it. It was the same discovery that people had been making in hard country for as long as hard country had existed, that 2 careful people who respect each other's capacity and attend to the same ground will find, over the course of a winter and its work and its cold nights and its difficult mornings, that they have built something neither of them could have named at the start. Clara would have approved. He had thought about this carefully, the way he thought about careful things, and he arrived at it with the certainty of an honest accounting. Clara would have been capable of that, because Clara had been a person of sufficient size to hold approval and grief in the same heart without confusing them. He held them the same way. Now he put her coat in the cedar chest, in the back room, not discarded, but honored, the way you put something good in a safe place, so that it is preserved and not perpetually exposed to weather. Sina knew about the coat without being told. She knew it the way she knew the ledger and the feed ratios. And the second reason, by attention, by the reading of small evidence, by the patience of someone who has always understood that the important things require time to become legible. In April, the snow began its leaving. It did not leave all at once, but in the way of something that has stayed as long as it was needed, and now returns to what it was before. The meadow emerged from beneath it a little each day, the winter-flattened grass showing brown and then green at its tips, and the creek came up and ran fast and cold over the stones in its bed, and made the sound that it made, which she had given him the word for. He stood at the creek on the first warm morning, and said the word, and got it mostly right, and she stood beside him and listened and said nothing, which was her way of saying it was close enough. It was a thing that went together, the word and the sound, and the water, and the 2 of them, standing at the edge of it, in the early light with the ridge, white-capped above them, and the season turning under their boots. He had been a man who counted losses, and that had been correct and necessary, and he did not regret it. But this was the counting of a different kind of thing entirely, and it turned out he was good at that as well. One hawk settled on the fence post above the upper meadow gate, sat there for a moment looking at nothing in particular, with the bright and total attention of something that has excellent vision and knows it, and then lifted and was gone over the ridge. The fire had held all winter. That was the answer she had given him, not in words on the first night, but in the full weight of the season just concluded. in the banked coals, and the organized barn, and the counted posts, and the words learned badly and corrected without mercy, and the figures on the shelf, and the sworn statements in the document case, and the plain consent at the table in the firelight. The answer was yes, and here's how you do it, and now we are doing it together. It was not a rescue. It was not a rescue, and it was not a debt discharged, and it was not two broken things repaired into one adequate whole. It was two careful people who had attended to the same ground through a hard season and discovered, as Thomas had known they would, that the things which go together belong together, and that a life chosen freely is not the same thing as a life fallen into. The ridge had two names the fire had held. The water remembered itself. And that, in the end, was the full accounting.